You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 3rd of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and a warm welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, with Turkey formally asking for BRICS membership, we'll look at who'll come out better. Also ahead.
I ask for your forgiveness that we were not able to bring them back alive.
Benjamin Netanyahu issues an apology to the Israeli people but refuses to move further towards a ceasefire. Meanwhile, the UK reduces the number of arms licences it'll issue to Israel. We'll examine the reaction. Plus,
we help keep people in the country. We help them make it through the winter.
The chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development tells me more about the meeting point between international relations and money. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Is Turkey's application to join the BRICS group of countries a daring and brilliant move by the country's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, or an attempt to be everybody's friend? The organisation, which seems to be in the middle of a rapid expansion programme, has an aim of positioning itself as a credible alternative to the likes of the G7. Well, Hannah Lucinda Smith is Monocle's Istanbul correspondent, and I'm delighted to say she joins me on the line there. A very good afternoon to you, Hannah.
Good afternoon.
So just looking at this decision by President Erdogan and by Turkey, is this a pull of the BRICS towards a new stance, or is this also just as much a pushing away of the European Union?
I think it's a bit of both. And also, this shouldn't come as a massive surprise. Turkey, for a really long time, especially under President Erdogan, has been talking about how it's not necessarily bound to always be looking westwards. And particularly since 2016, when the relations between Turkey and the European Union really started to nosedive, Turkey has increasingly looked not only towards organisations like BRICS, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation. Famously or notoriously, President Erdogan's also built his own relations with leaders like Vladimir Putin as well. And there is a very strong bloc within Turkish politics who say, geographically and also culturally, we shouldn't be putting all of our eggs in the Western basket. We should be looking to diversify. Now, clearly, this is not just an economic thing. There are political aspects to this as well. President Erdogan, again, is not known for being an easy leader to deal with, particularly for Western organisations, and he often uses these kind of moves as a way to either show that he's the kind of leader that isn't afraid to stand up to the West, as he would put it. That often does very well for him around election times, but also to show that Turkey is a country that likes to talk about its own independence. It doesn't want to feel like it's being forced to be part of any club. So I think it's not a massively surprising thing that they are looking to join BRICS now.
But in the wider context, Turkey is a member of NATO. And were it to be accepted into BRICS, it would be the first NATO member to be part of an economic bloc which is spearheaded by Moscow and Beijing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not going to go down well in Western capitals, even if it is expected. And, it is a kind of difficult time. We always talk about things sort of getting better between Turkey and the EU and Turkey and the US. But these relations are strained, and they've been strained particularly by certain things that President Erdogan has done in relation to the NATO alliance. So most recently, sort of really holding back the membership of Sweden and Finland, again, trying to get things in return. Also his purchase a few years ago of the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. These are things that do worry Western capitals really deeply. But here's the thing, and this is what Erdogan knows and plays on. Turkey is a really important NATO member, and now more so than ever since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. Of course, Turkey also gets its benefits from being a part of NATO. And I think, the more kind of reasonable people surrounding Erdogan will, in fact, say that, Turkey has no ambitions to leave NATO, but it does like to play its strength and its cards there to its own advantages. That
playing of cards and playing to your own advantage is fine while it lasts, but will there be a moment, and one wonders at what point the Rubicon will be crossed, when someone says, actually, hang on, we cannot have Turkey trying to be friends with Russia and China, refining the oil that's coming out of Russia and helping it get out into the rest of the world, playing Russia's friend, playing China's friend, playing America's friend, playing the European Union's friend. Someone at one point is going to say, we cannot do this. Is there a risk here that Erdogan could push it too far?
Yeah, absolutely. And, he keeps seeming to sort of almost dip his toe in the Rubicon repeatedly. But, whenever there are threats of some action being taken, most recently from the US, the threat of secondary sanctions over Turkey's continuing assistance of Russia, and it talks about setting up a gas hub in Turkey and things like that, but they never seem to fully come to fruition. I think another thing that's interesting to look at is actually the attitudes amongst the Turkish population. The reason why President Erdogan does this is because there is this really strong anti-Western and particularly anti-American undercurrent within the Turkish population. That's not new. That has always been there. And you might have seen yesterday there was a US ship docked in the port of Izmir, and two of the American servicemen on that ship were attacked in the street by a Turkish leftist nationalist youth group. This is something that happens. But really interestingly, since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's been a kind of shift. The Turkish public in general is now more amenable to NATO. I think it looks at what's happening in Ukraine, it sees the threat from Russia, and it realizes that, maybe it's not such a bad thing to be part of this alliance. So I think at some point it might not just become, valuable for President Erdogan to do these kind of things. And from the point of view of the likes of Russia and China, they will clearly enjoy this, given the fact that they will have access via Turkey to markets out from which they are currently either restricted or barred. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a political dimension to that as well. Part of the reason, or a major reason, why President Putin has been so accommodating and so solicitous of President Erdogan in recent years is because it has driven such a wedge in the heart of NATO. It's just taken so much attention. Every NATO summit has been talking about what to do about Turkey, and that's really beneficial for Putin. So I think, again, Turkey applying to join an organisation like BRICS plays that same advantage for Putin. Hannah, Lucinda Smith joining us on the line from Istanbul there. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is 8 minutes past midday. You're with The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Emma. Volkswagen has announced it may close factories and cut jobs as part of a revised savings plan aiming to cut back 4 billion euros more than initially planned. Meanwhile, former Volkswagen CEO Martin Wiltekorn goes on trial today, 9 years after the Dieselgate scandal first broke. A beluga whale known as Hvaldimir, once suspected of being a Russian spy, has been found dead in southwest Norway. The whale's body has been taken for expert examination. Hvaldimir was wearing a harness with a camera mount labeled Equipment of St. Petersburg. And Seoul's Incheon Airport will introduce new guidelines for handling private security for celebrities. This follows complaints in July about excessive security measures for actor Byung Un-sok. The new manual instructs airport police to step in for crowd control when at least 300 people are gathered at the gate. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Laura. Pope Francis has landed in the Indonesian capital Jakarta at the start of an historic trip to the region. The 12-day visit will mark the longest time he's been away from the Vatican. After Indonesia, his visit will also include Papua New Guinea and Singapore, among other countries. And Juliet Linley is a journalist and former Vatican correspondent. I'm delighted to say she joins me now from our Zurich studio. A very good afternoon to you, Juliet. How is Dufourstrasse 90?
Hello, Emma. Greetings from a very sunny Dufourstrasse 90.
Glad to hear about it. Right, let's talk about the Pope. This is a big tour for him, literally, geographically, and also figuratively.
Indeed. So he landed this morning in Jakarta after a 13-hour flight from Rome. This is his 45th international trip, his 7th to Asia. And all of this despite ongoing knee issues and many of us worrying about his health. So upon landing, he already met with a group of refugees, as well as some elderly and homeless groups, which are always groups of people that are very close to Francis's heart, no matter where he is in the world. He seems pretty buoyant, so his health seems to be pretty good. He's 87, remember, Emma. And although his doctor and nurse are with him on this 22,000-kilometer trip, there are no other special precautions being taken. So fingers crossed, everything sounds good. Now, yes, despite the geography, this is also a big trip for many other reasons. So Francis is determined to use this opportunity to focus on interfaith dialogue, unity, multilateralism, calls for peace, as well as climate change and fighting poverty. Now, these are often his key agenda items. And he also wants to focus on going far away. This is a trip far from his seat at the Vatican City, and he always talks about going out into the peripheries. Now, this is Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim population country. Only 3% are Catholics. That does still mean that it's around 8 million Catholics that are in the country. And he's going to hold a mass, and he's going to say mass for 60,000 people in a stadium. And it's a clear effort to encourage strong ties with the Muslim world, interfaith dialogue, and he's not, however, expected to focus too much on the country's more recent discrimination against Christians or tensions. This is very much a trip to sort of focus on the positives, on peaceful coexistence between cultures and religions. Now, the Pope doesn't usually, in fact, sort of wag fingers at his host when he does go on one of his trips. And tomorrow he's expected to meet President Joko Widodo, and no finger wagging expected there, Emma, though we will be watching it closely.
It's an interesting point to make in terms of the importance of Asia to the Catholic Church, isn't it? Because he's clearly incorporating several countries, which, it's been a very, very long time, decades since, for example, a Pope has been in Indonesia. I think it was Pope John Paul II who was the last to visit. How key is it to the Catholic Church that the Asian part of the world is kept very much within the Church's bosom?
Asia is so important, excuse me, for the Catholics. I mean, if we just look at what Richard Gallagher, the Vatican's foreign minister, what he said recently, it's undeniably important. He said Asia represents a positive model of dialogue and respect that the Church and the world can benefit from. So yes, you said that he was going to be going to Papua New Guinea, a heavily Christian country. He's also going to be visiting East Timor, Asia's first Catholic nation. He's the first pontiff to visit since its independence in 2002. And we can expect the Pope to appeal for an end to conflict. Also, let's say in Gaza and Ukraine, in this country that is still scarred by decades of conflict. But the focal point, I would say, is Singapore. That's where he ends his trip. And in terms of geopolitical interest, Emma, this is the leg that is most interesting for us, and it's highly anticipated because of the strong ties with Beijing. So some are wondering whether the Pope might take this opportunity to try to get Singapore to broker a tightening of relations between the Vatican and China as Holy See negotiations proceed about new bishop appointments with Beijing. And also some are wondering whether the Vatican might like to see China playing a bigger role in peace mediation, perhaps.
Well, you were talking about peace mediation and wagging fingers. There's another story which is dominating the headlines when it comes to the Pope, and it's the fact that Francis has found himself, hasn't he, at the centre of this row about immigration in Italy. We have this increasingly vitriolic flow of the former military general turned firebrand Roberto Vannacci, the author of some pretty strong-worded books. And the Pope's been kind of caught in the undertow of this one, hasn't he?
Exactly. So he's witnessing a bit of a showdown between these two high-profile personalities who couldn't be more different, yet they do have some conservative positions in common. So on the one hand, we've got Francis, staunch supporter of migrants' rights, loud voice on fighting climate change, but he's also, of course, anti-abortion as head of the Catholic Church, and he's not a big fan of American hegemony, Emma. And on the other hand, we have Roberto Vannacci, blatantly anti-immigrant, unashamedly anti-gay, hardly a diehard feminist, but not pro-life in the least, and someone who wouldn't mind perhaps Italy even leaving NATO. So the anti-abortion and the not too big a fan of the US are common positions of theirs. However, on all other fronts, they are at loggerheads. And now, for the first time, this 55-year-old former paratrooper, who, as you say, highly controversial, he's become known as Italy's best-known general, possibly for all the wrong reasons. So he publicly came out against Pope Francis, declaring that, he came out on Facebook, actually, very brashly, against what Pope Francis had declared was that rejecting migrants is a grave sin. And Vanacci said, well, you know what? The Vatican has always defended its borders. Why can Italy not do the same?
Now,
Tell us.
There is a thing, though, in Italy, isn't it, that criticising the Pope is generally considered an ill-advised thing to do. So what is it about Vanacci that thinks that he can?
Well, there you go. So two things. So firstly, until now, Vanacci figured it wasn't in his interest, perhaps, to isolate voters on the right and pick a fight with none other than the pontiff. But now it seems that he's decided to do so. So it's not necessarily, he's thinking maybe it's not necessarily that bad to air your grievances with the Pope and to go and to perhaps look for more support from Italy's conservatives. Secondly, he's not the only politician to have objected to statements from different church leaders, perhaps not blatantly the Pope's, but still on migrants. So he's definitely the most high profile one. And ironically, thanks to the Italian media's pilloring of him over the last year, he has become high profile. So essentially, ever since he published this controversial book that you mentioned earlier called The World Upside Down, laying out his unsavory views on a number of hot button topics, the media did such a great job of giving him free airtime, Emma, that this otherwise unconsequential book became a bestseller. And then he wrote another one. And then he stood for the European Parliament. And then he won, getting the second highest number of votes last June, right after Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. That's what makes him fearless, Emma.
Juliet Lindley, thank you for joining us on the line from Dufourstrasse 90. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. 12:16 here in London. Now, Israel has accused the United Kingdom of rewarding Hamas after the British Foreign Secretary announced the suspension of some arms export licences. David Lammy said there was evidence of a clear risk that UK arms may be used in serious violations of international humanitarian law. Well, joining me now from Jerusalem is Nimrod Goren, who's a senior fellow for Israeli affairs at the Middle East Institute and the founder of the Israeli foreign policy think tank Mitvim. A very good afternoon to you, Nimrod. Good to have you back.
Thank you, Emma.
So in terms of the scale of the licences which are being issued, this is a comparatively small number. So the emphasis seems to be here on the symbolic gesture or the symbolic move that the UK is making.
It's symbolic, but it's also diplomatic and geopolitical, because it shows that the process that Israel is experiencing over the last month, that it loses traction within the international community. It sees some of its closest allies take some distance from it. Even symbolic gestures by the UK can lead to more significant steps taken by other countries because it's seen as a green light, perhaps also having some American backing. So from the Israeli point of view, it's not as if the security aspect of whatever happened is dramatic, but how it fits into a bigger process of Israel's global standing and international alliances and partnership raises some question marks and showcase the failure of our governments in terms of managing the diplomatic side of the war and the consequences of the war not ending.
Indeed. I mean, some are saying that, look, this is giving a sort of symbolic victory to Hamas, but at the same time, it is a lesson or a message to Israel of you need to listen more closely to your friends. Is that correct?
I think for Israel to listen, the message should first and foremost come from Washington. That's the international power that Israel listens the most to, that has most of the leverage over Israel. And for the past 7-8 months, we see the American administration trying to broker a ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza and not really succeeding in that. The Americans are now trying to step up their pressure on Israel, on Netanyahu, to change his course. I think if someone can change the Israeli positions or policies, it will be Washington, not one of the European capitals.
And regionally, though, if you are an ally of Hamas or you are trying to forge some sort of peace, some sort of ceasefire, if you're Egypt, if you're Qatar, if you're Iran, what message does this convey to you?
I think it conveys a message that we need to get this ceasefire and hostage release deal done with. Okay, it's been for ages. In Israel, there is a sense of urgency now. We saw just 6 more hostages were brought back home dead a few days ago. They were alive several days ago. They were supposed to be released in the humanitarian first phase of a deal that wasn't reached. Egypt and Qatar have been brokering. Iran, of course, has other interest and motivation. It is clearly on the side against Israel, but Egypt is a country that Israel has a peace treaty with. Qatar is a country that Israel has been cooperating with despite not having diplomatic ties. I think the mediators, the US, Egypt, and Qatar, need to reflect on how they conducted their mediation until now, and if they really want to get a deal. And there are question marks how much the American administration is willing to use its leverage at this point of time with the US elections drawing near. They need to do some things different. The Americans try to indicate that they may put a blame on whoever is blocking the negotiations. I'm not sure that will change the mindset neither of Sinwar nor of Netanyahu at this point of time.
Tell us finally about the effectiveness of yesterday's protests and general strike in Israel. The pushing now for people to come to the table and for compromises to be made. I mean, some people in Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu, the most vocal voice in all this, saying that if you withdraw army forces from Gaza, if you sign a hostage deal to Hamas, that equates with surrender.
For many Israelis, reaching the hostage deal is the victory of the war, because Israel has been fighting for Hamas for almost a year now. It reached quite a lot of achievements on the battlefield, but in terms of bringing our people back, and there are more than 100 hostages still held by Hamas, and we see their fate not with a positive trend, more and more threat to their lives. Some of them we know that are not living anymore. So that's what the Israeli public wants to see, and there is a majority for that. We now saw the public not only support it in the polls, but mobilizing to the streets, protesting in big numbers. We hear the Minister of Defense, who is part of Netanyahu's own political party, speaking up against Netanyahu policy. We see security officials talking in support of a deal. So there's a lot of anger and frustration in Israel because it seems like the prime minister is highlighting something that was a non-issue several months ago and wasn't that big of a stumbling block in previous phases of negotiations. And now it's becoming the biggest obstacle to a deal, which basically reflects that the political will of the prime minister isn't there when it comes to the proposal that is currently on the table and which most Israelis support.
Nimrod Goren, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing. Time now for a business news roundup. I'm delighted to be joined by Victoria Scholar, Head of Investment at Interactive Investor. Very good afternoon to you, Victoria.
Afternoon.
Let us begin with the problems for Airbus. We are very used to talking about Boeing having issues with its aircraft, but we have a flight from, am I right in thinking, Hong Kong to Zurich, which should have reached its destination but had to return to Hong Kong 75 minutes after taking off because of a problem with the Rolls-Royce engines?
Yes, that's right. So Rolls-Royce is facing problems. Its shares were down more than 6% yesterday, and it's trying to regain ground today. Cathay Pacific has cancelled 24 flights amid precautionary inspections across its fleet of aircraft, and we've seen that £2.7 billion were wiped off Rolls-Royce's market cap as a consequence because there was a problem with one of its engines. We've also learned that 8 of Cathay's 9 flights from Hong Kong to Singapore have been cancelled today after one part on one of its wide-body planes, which uses one of the Rolls-Royce engines, failed. So that was shortly after takeoff, like you say, from Hong Kong to Zurich on Monday. But Rolls-Royce says that it's committed to working closely with the airlines over the issues. Airbus also says it's been in contact with Rolls-Royce and Cathay Pacific, and it's offering its full technical support.
It's an interesting thing because every time you hear an A380 or an A350 pass overhead, you have this unmistakable whir from a Rolls-Royce engine, which kind of defines what the A350 and the A380 sound like. But for so long, we have all been looking at Airbus with such a favourable gaze, simply because Boeing has had so many problems. How much does an incident like this affect the Airbus brand in the long term?
Well, I think that it certainly has an impact on confidence for sure. And when it comes to Rolls-Royce, this is a company that's been a real stock market darling lately. It's had a new CEO a couple of years ago who's spearheaded this turnaround plan. And we've seen that this seems to be a blip, but clearly these highly publicised issues are negative for the industry.
Let's move on to the return to the office, and some data's out today showing that Paris and New York are way ahead of London in terms of the number of people heading back to work. I think anybody who's been to any of those three cities in the last few weeks or months would be able to notice that quite simply and easily.
Yes, that's right. So what we've seen is that London is trailing behind Paris and New York in terms of the return to the office, and that's raised concerns about a negative possible impact on UK productivity. This is according to a new research from the Centre for Cities, a think tank. It says that in London, people are spending an average of 2.7 days in the office versus 3.5 days in Paris and 3.1 days in New York, and also that midweek averages for office attendance in London is still stuck at about 60% of where it was before the pandemic. So there are worries about what this could mean in terms of the British economy long term. And essentially, no one really knows. But this think tank believes that back to the office is the best strategy. And as a result, it's been urging the government and the Mayor of London to work with businesses to try and increase office attendance.
There has, however, especially here in London, a phrase emerging recently saying that companies have to earn the commute, suggesting that the balance of power here is no longer, or is threatening to no longer be, in the hands of the bosses, but in the workers who say, OK, convince me to come back in.
Yeah, and of course there are lots of benefits to flexible working, particularly for mums, for example, who might like the flexibility. But also there's a business case for it as well, because office space is expensive. And we've seen that a lot of companies have been downsizing from large offices to smaller offices because there are fewer people in the office on a regular basis. And that does help to create a cost saving.
Victoria Scholar, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us on The Briefing. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Finally, today we return to the annual GlobeSec Forum on Foreign Policy, Security, European Affairs and Economy. It came to a close at the end of the weekend in Prague, attended by the Monocle team, with trade tensions between the West and China top of the agenda this year. Monocle's senior news editor Chris Chermak was joined by Beata Javorczyk, chief economist from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to talk about the state of international relations.
I'm very much worried about global fragmentation. I'm worried about the fact that trade policy is now being decided mostly by ministries of foreign affairs rather than ministries of economy, that it is driven by geopolitical considerations rather than economic considerations. And of course, I'm worried about the economic implications of growing trade barriers. But there is yet another thing that is even more worrisome. That is the fact that growing trade tensions can slow down the progress of green transition in Europe. Now, why is that? That's because green transition is heavily reliant on mineral inputs. Electric car requires 6 times as much of mineral inputs as a combustion engine car. Graphite is one of them. Offshore wind energy requires rare earth. These are the powerful magnets. Now, graphite was in the news a lot last year because of export restrictions introduced by China, as was gallium and germanium, 2 other minerals that are needed by the high-tech industry. So I worry that growing trade tensions between Europe and China will result in China imposing additional restrictions that will cut off European access to those critical raw materials.
It is an interesting aspect of this, I suppose, the way that you raise it. Do you get the sense sometimes as an economist that at the moment, say even governments in Europe or the US are almost sort of prioritizing the geopolitics over the economics? Because when you do take something like the green transition, it would make sense for European economies to have China's help, to bring in low-cost EVs and the rest of it. This would be of benefit to the economy, and yet it's being stopped for other considerations.
Well, indeed. And sometimes I feel like different parts of policy-making entities are pursuing different objectives without the regard for what is being done by others. At the EBRD, in our last transition report, we asked the question, who holds the reserves of critical raw minerals? And we divided the world into two blocks, the Western bloc and the other bloc, based on how countries have voted at the United Nations over a decade or so. And the picture is not pretty because a large share of known reserves of some of those critical raw materials, be it rare earth or graphite, are not held by the Western bloc. And you may not know that developing a new mine takes a long time. Actually, there are rare earth deposits in Sweden, and the state-owned company that is developing them said it will take between 10 and 15 years to start producing them. So the challenge is that an export restriction can be introduced at the stroke of a pen, while developing alternative supply sources takes a long time.
What kind of impact is that having on the economies, particularly in the regions that you cover? Because many also in Central and Eastern Europe rely on, frankly, China as well as the European Union also for foreign direct investment and those kinds of issues. What kind of impact of these trade disputes are you seeing in the economies you look at?
So we have seen a surge in Chinese investment in countries, in the regions where the EBRD operates, in places such as Hungary, but also Serbia and Morocco. And Morocco is a very interesting case. It's a country that has a free trade agreement with the US, and therefore batteries that may be produced in Chinese-run facilities and then exported to the US could potentially qualify for subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act. So it seems like the Inflation Reduction Act has a reach that goes beyond the US borders.
Which is always one of these interesting aspects of the way this works, isn't it? That something that the US does has actually quite a surprisingly big impact on European economies.
Absolutely.
One other thing I did want to ask you about, I wanted to turn to Ukraine for a little bit because this is something else that the EBRD has been very active in, the reconstruction of Ukraine. But before we get to the reconstruction after the war, as it were, I was curious for your take on how the Ukrainian economy is holding up at the moment, because it is something that is incredibly tricky in wartime, of course, incredibly challenging. And yet the sense one gets is there is some way that Ukraine is holding this together and is continuing not as normal, but is managing to find ways to keep its economy going.
So the economy of Ukraine took a huge hit as a result of the war. 30% of GDP disappeared in 2022. Last year, they managed to grow, though from a much smaller base. But the achievement that's really impressive is keeping the macroeconomic stability. So in other words, bringing the inflation down, reaching preliminary agreement with the creditors, keeping the state functioning. That is something that should not be underestimated, as well as the fact that the war has focused minds and actually has led to some reforms, for instance, of governance of state-owned enterprises. But of course, the situation is incredibly challenging. As the EBRD, we are focusing on supporting Ukraine now, on helping the country get through the winter by helping the country invest in power generation. That is particularly important after the recent Russian attacks that destroyed a very large share of power generation capacity.
Well, and when you talk about supporting Ukraine now, to turn that to the word reconstruction, I do wonder sometimes, is that something that you see as what happens later, or is it actually something that is ongoing? The reconstruction of Ukraine is something that is needed every day at the moment. Is that how the EBRD approaches it as well in terms of what you're doing there?
we are supporting Ukraine now in order to position it well for reconstruction when the time for reconstruction comes. Let me explain. All of the discussion about reconstruction tends to focus on finance, on physical investment. But human capital is equally, if not more important for the success of reconstruction. So by helping Ukrainian people make it through the winter, and we are planning to help not only state-run energy sector, but also SMEs and households, we help keep people in the country, we help them make it through the winter. And that means that when the time for reconstruction comes, they will be in the country and they will be ready to start rebuilding the economy.
And that was Beata Jaworczyk in conversation with Monocle's Chris Chermak at Globsec. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer, Tom Webb. Our researcher was Sana Jamani and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.